government ever right the wrongs of their past abuses? Can a person ever fully cope with the effects of being violently attacked against their identity? Can someone ever find peace within themselves after being coerced into committing atrocities? Questions like these led me to take a deeper look into Ariel Dorfman's Death in the Maiden in my project, Reaching Reconciliation. With these questions in mind, and along with my research, I landed on this thesis. Ariel Dorfman's Death in the Maiden forces readers to face the attempts at pursuing justice from Gerardo, Paulina, and Roberto to determine the efficacy of reconciliation for the establishment responsible for their trauma, the hands liable for carrying it out, and for the traumatized individual. I began my research with political reconciliation and how this is exhibited by Gerardo. Manuel Cardenas explains to us this idea of transitional justice and how Chile took this up after their authoritarian ruler Pinochet was dismantled. This began in their pursuit for democracy, and they established many truth commissions. The one that we see most exemplified in Death in the Maiden is the National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, which was established in Chile in 1991. It was in hopes to provide as complete an understanding as possible for the people they deemed to have suffered the most severe human rights abuse, death, or one worse than that in Pinochet's era, disappearance. We can immediately start to see how this is exhibited in Death in the Maiden by Dorfman. In this quotation here, Paulina and Gerardo are having a conversation that almost exactly mirrors the case of the account in Chile. I think what's most important in this quote, though, is what's not being said. The fact that Paulina is calling out these commissions for only including those that have died or presumably died, it means that there's a whole population that's being left out, one that she is a part of. And this leads us to this idea of how do you determine an efficacy of a mission in doing their job for reconciliation. A study was conducted that Cardenas explains, and it was to address public opinion surrounding the published findings of the truth commissions, and they found that, quote, a large majority believed that even after 30 years, the socio-political conflict had not been overcome and reconciliation had not been achieved. I think there's not really a better way to determine the fact that these commissions were not effective other than the word of the people themselves in Chile, and I think that Paulina brings up the same point here. The fact that Gerardo is a man that still holds strong faith in the Chilean government as he's striving to reach his own political ambitions by taking this role, but what can he do to right the wrongs of the past the government could not have done in the last 17 years? This led me directly to the discussion of personal reconciliation and how we determine if people could ever reconcile what happened to them. I did make a distinction, though, between the tortured and the torturer, which creates a unique conversation that isn't usually presented in the idea of Death in the Maiden, but I did begin with the idea of the tortured and how this is exhibited by Paulina. Royce-Blot explains to us that survivors of rape and torture in Chile and in general have difficulty understanding and articulating what has happened to them. This has detrimental effects on their psyche between the struggle to create a coherent account of what happened to them in their own brain, and then because of that, finding it difficult to confide in others in what happened to them. This creates a cycle of isolation in their own mind. From there, they experience emotional outbursts, troubles in interpersonal relationships, and psychosomatic ailments. And we can most definitely see how this comes about in Paulina's story as well. This quote here, I think, again, what's more important is what's not being said. The fact that Gerardo can't even say, quote, word for word what happened to Paulina, but instead he's speaking around it, exemplifies the secrecy around what happened to Paulina and those like her. I think this also demonstrates for us the fact that there was no support sought for Paulina. Because of that, she has been suffering with a long-term relationship with silence. Which brings us to a discussion brought about by Carolina Carrera, this idea that survivors faced a cycle of silence. This happens because society prevents these women from seeing their experience as truly torture, the overwhelming embarrassment that survivors face, as well as the fact that they survived, which was seen as, quote, nothing compared to what others had gone through. All of this has effects on the ability to cope with what happened. And I think we can see this silence taken out on Paulina in multiple ways, and that's why I have two quotes here. The first is the fact that even while she was being tortured, Paulina never spoke Gerardo's name. She protected her husband through the end. And then even after her torture, she had no one to go to. She couldn't talk to her husband about it. She couldn't talk to her family because they've had faith in the government. I think this is really exemplary of the other survivors in Chile as well, because Paulina has been silenced, first by her abusers, but also by her family's belief in the government and Roberto's devotion to it. Which leads us directly to, what does Paulina do about it? Royce explains that the shameful cycle of silence evokes a response that is often related to revenge, directed outwardly towards others and inwardly towards the self. We obviously know that the dominating plotline for the story is the fact that Paulina is exacting her revenge on Roberto, but this is because Paulina is demonstrating someone that has lost faith in their government to reconcile the crimes that were committed against her. As a result, she's forced to exact her own revenge on the man she holds responsible for her suffering. I think and I choose this quote here just because this is where she actually states out loud what she's planning to do. I think that we can also translate this concept into determining if she has reached reconciliation or not, which I believe she has not. I think that she turns this thirst for revenge from outward to inward. Rather than shooting and killing Roberto, I think she is forced to live out the rest of her days in the same state of silence that she's become too familiar with. At the concert, I think that she has reached a level of dissociative complacency, which Royce explains as the dissociation in the individual or to the family related to psychological survival in the absence of any perceived resolution. I think that Paulina is past the pursuit of justice and has ended up completely defeated by the system that failed to provide it for her. Which leads you right up to the discussion of the torturer and how Roberto exemplifies this character in the novel, in the play. Unsurprisingly, there's not a lot of research in the world on the torturer because under amnesty, they weren't forced to face any punishment for their crimes. So I turned my research to the idea of the Pinochet era and torturers in general. Human Rights Watch explains to us that there was a second commission that was put out in 2003 in Chile that determined that torture was not just a periodic tool for extracting information, but it was inextricably woven into the policy and command of Pinochet. This state policy of torture gives us the framework that we need to understand how police officers and members of the military could be convinced or forced to commit unspeakable acts, even if they weren't born killers. This quote here is where Roberto addresses what he began to think his role was, and I think that this is important because we see just how quickly he was influenced by the state of the prisons and coerced into seeing prisoners as less than human. I think in understanding if his reconciliation is ever met, I turned to an interview that Bonfoy Pascal did with an ex-Chilean soldier, Guillermo Padilla, and explains that Mr. Padilla still carries emotional scars for having been forced to witness or commit atrocities, because many were ordered on fear of death to beat, kill, torture, or rape innocent people. Moving forward with this, Mr. Padilla discusses the fact that he seeks forgiveness for his acts, but knows that he can't just go ask for it because many people still see him and other soldiers as criminals for what they've done. I think this is a most uncanny resemblance to this quotation here from Roberto in his confession. The fact that he is speaking so closely to that of the historical account, I think is what makes it so difficult to believe that he's speaking off script. Which is why I believe that this is his true confession. But by refuting this confession as Paulina's truth rather than his own, he removes his chance for reconciliation as well. He cannot take part in the establishment of a collective narrative, find peace with his acts if he can't admit that he's committed them, or seek justice from the government that made him into a monster. In the end, I concluded that Dorfman was intentionally displaying this lack of justice for those in the play with his contextual elements around Chile by making his readers or viewers understand the hardship of the Pinochet dictatorship with a humanized lens. Chile has failed to reach reconciliation for its people. These events have shaped the way that victims see themselves, the way that abusers understand their identity, and the way that the world knows Chile. And I don't think you can ever truly reconcile that.